Dawn never truly arrived over the airfield at Coltishall on that bitter morning in early 1941. A low, metallic sky pressed down on the frost-bitten runways, turning every surface into a dull mirror of gray. Mechanics moved between dispersals with their collars up, breath fogging in the cold air, when the distant growl of engines began to rise, first a vibration underfoot, then a steady, approaching thunder. Moments later, the sirens cut through the silence, their wails slicing across the airfield as Luftwaffe bombers emerged from the clouds like dark shapes dragged out of the dawn. Anti-aircraft batteries opened first, sending clattering echoes across the concrete. Shrapnel whistled down like angry rain. Fuel trucks were hurried behind blast walls. Ground crews dove for shelter, yet one man, an RAF mechanic known more for his stubborn ingenuity than rank, remained beside the strange contraption he had been assembling from scrap for weeks. A cluster of barrels, a salvaged aircraft mounting, and a hand crank mechanism he had filed smooth by lamplight. He gripped the handles now, the cold metal biting into his palms, as the bombers began their final run. 14 minutes later, nothing on this airfield would be remembered the same way. By early 1940, the skies over Britain had become the first true theater of modern aerial warfare. The Royal Air Force was stretched thin, tasked not only with flying sorties over occupied Europe but also with defending its own airfields from increasingly frequent Luftwaffe raids. Ground crews, often unsung, formed the backbone of this defense. Mechanics, armorers, and fitters worked tirelessly under freezing winds, repairing fighters, maintaining engines, and ensuring that every aircraft could scramble at a moment's notice. Their expertise, practical and inventive, would often tip the scales between life and death on the front line. The Luftwaffe's strategy during this period focused on both intimidation and destruction. German bombers, flying in tight formations, sought to cripple Britain's industrial and military capacity. Attacks were concentrated on key RAF airfields, munitions depots, and radar stations. By striking early in the morning or under the cover of clouds, they hoped to disrupt flight schedules and sow chaos among crews who were already exhausted by the ceaseless tempo of wartime operations. Yet the RAF's anti-aircraft defenses were far from sufficient. Heavy and medium AA guns were concentrated around strategic cities, leaving many airfields vulnerable. At smaller bases, ground personnel relied on light machine guns or even rifles to fend off bombers, improvisation born of necessity. Scraps of steel, salvaged aircraft barrels, and discarded engine parts became the raw materials for ad hoc defenses. This was not novelty, it was survival. Men who could repair Merlin engines also learned to jury-rig multi-barrel weapons, adapting their mechanical knowledge to the urgent demands of war. This culture of ingenuity reflected the broader pressures of the RAF's organizational structure. Commanders understood the need for innovation but remained bound by logistics, bureaucracy, and the limits of supply. Mechanics found themselves negotiating these constraints daily, inventing, testing, and deploying weapons that no official blueprint had ever sanctioned. By necessity, the line between engineer, soldier, and survivalist blurred, as the men on the ground became the first, and sometimes only line of defense against a highly trained aerial enemy. The stage was set. The pressures of scarce resources, constant threat, and frontline experience converged, creating an environment where improvisation was not a choice but a requirement. Into this crucible stepped the man who would soon challenge the Luftwaffe with nothing more than his hands, his wits, and salvaged metal. Life on an RAF station during the Blitz was a relentless rhythm of preparation, repair, and constant alert. Mechanics rose before dawn, often sleeping in improvised quarters beside rows of grounded fighters, only to be pulled into the chaos of a raid at any hour. Their days were measured not in hours but in sorties repaired, engines overhauled, and ammunition loaded. Outside, the distant droning of German bombers was a constant reminder that every second counted. Inside the hangars, wrenches and files moved as quickly as the men's hands could manage. The skills required went far beyond the manuals. Mechanics needed intimate knowledge of engine tolerances, hydraulic systems, and ammunition handling, but they also needed imagination. When official weapons were unavailable or too few in number, they turned to scrap, abandoned aircraft parts, discarded barrels, and surplus hardware, transforming these fragments into functional defensive tools. Improvised defenses became an accepted part of life, from sandbag-protected machine gun nests to rudimentary flak contraptions cobbled together from salvaged materials. These creations were rarely elegant, but they were effective in the right hands. Historical records from RAF airfields like Biggin Hill and Tangmere document countless instances of such ingenuity. One mechanic jury-rigged a .303 machine gun onto a biplane strut to cover blind spots during night raids. Another reinforced light AA guns with parts from obsolete training aircraft, increasing rate of fire at critical moments. These adaptations were not officially sanctioned, but in the pressure cooker of aerial attack, practicality trumped protocol. Constructing a multi-barrel, hand-cranked weapon, while unusual, was feasible. Mechanics understood barrel harmonics, feed mechanisms, and recoil management, knowledge gleaned from both aircraft maintenance and years of observing operational aircraft guns. By combining salvaged barrels with a manually operated crank system and improvised mounting, a resourceful mechanic could build a weapon capable of rapid fire, sufficient to disrupt a bomber formation flying low over the airfield. It required precision, timing, and an acute awareness of both human and mechanical limits. By the morning of that fateful raid, the airfield was a crucible of tension. Every man knew the stakes, every improvised defense counted. In this environment, survival depended as much on ingenuity as on courage. The stage was set not just for a single man's act of improvisation, but for a 14-minute episode that would demonstrate the raw intersection of skill, desperation, and human will. Human angle. For the ground crew, the day began before sunrise and often ended long after the last bomber had disappeared into the clouds. Fatigue was constant, etched into faces lined with soot and stress. Fear was never far behind. The whine of approaching aircraft could freeze a man mid-step, wrenching him from the mechanical rhythm of the day. Each raid brought the knowledge that mistakes could be fatal. Mechanics carry not only tools but the weight of responsibility for the pilots in the air. Their hands, skilled at delicate repairs, were equally adept at improvising defenses, but even the most competent could be tested beyond endurance. The human element, the courage to act despite exhaustion, the presence of mind under fire, was as critical as any weapon. In these moments, improvisation became a measure of resilience as much as ingenuity. Technological angle. The weapon in question was a mechanical marvel of necessity rather than design. Built from salvaged aircraft barrels, a crank mechanism, and improvised mountings, it followed principles familiar to those who maintained Browning .303 guns on Spitfires and Hurricanes. The hand crank feed allowed rapid fire without a motorized system, exploiting the mechanic's knowledge of recoil, barrel harmonics, and ammunition alignment. Each component reflected a careful understanding of existing technology. Barrels chosen for consistency, mounts reinforced to absorb vibrations, and cranks smoothed for continuous operation. It was a machine forged in desperation, but its construction was deeply rooted in the mechanical literacy that every RAF mechanic cultivated during long, exacting hours of repair work. Tactical angle. Low-flying bombers were vulnerable, particularly during strafing runs or when lining up for accurate bombing drops. The Luftwaffe relied on precision and altitude, but operational necessity often forced crews into predictable paths over airfields. Improvised weapons could exploit these tactical openings, converting limited resources into effective deterrents. Ground crews understood patterns of attack. Bombers slowed, concentrated, or descended to avoid flak. By positioning makeshift weapons strategically, mechanics could maximize exposure to these vulnerabilities. The combination of speed, height, and formation offered fleeting windows where ingenuity on the ground could directly counter aerial superiority. The tactical logic was simple: anticipate the path, prepare the weapon, and strike at the moment of exposure. Leadership angle. Officers on RAF stations faced a delicate balance between discipline and pragmatism. Some were skeptical of improvised defenses, fearing accidents, misfires, or a breach of protocol. Others recognized the ingenuity and courage required to innovate under fire. In the case of a multi-barrel, hand-cranked weapon, leadership tacitly permitted its existence because the threat was immediate and conventional resources were insufficient. The mechanic operated under silent endorsement. Initiative was valued over formal approval when survival hung in the balance. Commanders who understood the stakes often deferred to those with the hands-on knowledge, knowing that practical expertise in a crisis could achieve results no theoretical plan could. This tension between hierarchy and improvisation shaped the environment in which extraordinary acts could occur. Enemy angle. From the Luftwaffe crew's perspective, ground fire was a familiar hazard, yet unpredictable. Improvised weapons introduced new variables. Bombers approaching low targets often expected rifles, light machine guns, or static flak, but a multi-barrel, rapidly cranked weapon could concentrate fire with unexpected intensity. Pilots trained to maintain formation and altitude sometimes found their tactics disrupted by these unusual threats. Confusion and surprise were as lethal as accuracy. Even a single downed aircraft could force a formation to break, scattering bombers and reducing bombing effectiveness. The psychological weight of unknown defenses could affect decision-making, turning a routine mission into a perilous gamble. Moral angle. At its core, the act of improvisation was an ethical as well as practical decision. Mechanics balanced duty, self-preservation, and the protection of others. Crafting a weapon from scrap was a statement of responsibility. When the official arsenal fell short, human initiative filled the gap. Survival and innovation became intertwined. The mechanic's choice to act was as much moral as mechanical. In those moments, courage was measured not by orders followed but by action taken in the face of imminent danger. This moral calculus framed every decision on the airfield, linking human ingenuity to the broader struggle for life and mission success. Together, these angles, human, technological, tactical, leadership, enemy, and moral, converge on a single point. The stage was set for a decisive moment. The conditions, the people, and the machines aligned, ready for the 14 minutes that would define both man and machine. It was 7:43 on a sharp morning in early 1941 when the first shadows of the Luftwaffe appeared over the Kulturschall perimeter. Engines droned, growing from distant hum to a relentless roar, shaking the frost-crusted hangars. Anti-aircraft batteries were already firing, sending sharp bursts into the low clouds, but the raid was concentrated and precise. The bombers were coming low, skimming the airfield with deadly intent. The mechanic tightened his grip on the crank handles of his improvised multi-barrel weapon. The barrels, salvaged from retired aircraft, shivered under his palms as he adjusted the feed mechanism for the first time in combat. Smoke from nearby A guns mingled with the frost, forming a surreal, gray haze. Hard hammering, he turned the crank, hearing the rasp of metal teeth and the staccato rhythm of rounds leaving the barrels. At 7:46, the first bomber entered his line of fire, descending slightly to line up for its bombing run. The bullets struck home. Tracer lines laced through the gray sky, slamming into the bomber's fuselage. Flames erupted near the engine, smoke trailing as the aircraft wavered. Ground crews ducked instinctively, some peering through gaps in the hangars to witness the impossible, one man's jury-rigged weapon sending a bomber down. Within 3 minutes, a second bomber faltered, its wing catching fire after rounds tore through fuel tanks. The mechanic barely had time to reset the feed before the next target presented itself. The combination of recoil, smoke, and rapid crank motion tested every ounce of strength. Fingers burned from friction, eyes watered from smoke and frost. Yet he persisted, driven by a mixture of adrenaline, fear, and necessity. Each confirmation, flashes of flame, falling debris, the distant thump of impact, sent waves of energy across the airfield. Nearby mechanics and soldiers began murmuring, astonishment mingled with urgency. The improvised weapon, a patchwork of ingenuity, had become a decisive factor in the first minutes of the raid. By 7:57, 3 bombers had been shot down, the remaining formation beginning to falter, forced to adjust altitude and course in response to the unexpected hail of fire. The stage was set for what would become a record of sustained, extraordinary defensive action, 14 minutes that would leave both men and machines forever marked. By 8 o'clock, the Luftwaffe formation was visibly disrupted. Bombers that had maintained tight intervals now wavered, engines straining as gunners and the improvised weapon combined to exact a brutal toll. The mechanic's hands ached, each turn of the crank sending tremors up his arms, but he did not falter. Tracer fire laced the sky, converging on targets with uncanny accuracy, a product of both instinct and months of mechanical familiarity. At 8:02, the fourth bomber shuddered violently as rounds tore through its port engine. Flames licked the fuselage, forcing the pilot to veer sharply, leaving the formation. The fifth bomber followed only minutes later, smoke streaming from its wingtip as the improvised barrels rattled continuously. Ground crews, huddled behind blast walls, watched in stunned silence. Some raised binoculars, others prayed quietly. The sight of a single mechanic controlling such destruction was at once terrifying and awe-inspiring. Minutes stretched, yet the cadence of the crank never slowed. By 8:08, the sixth bomber, attempting evasive maneuvers, found itself within the crosshairs once again. A precise burst struck the cockpit area, and the aircraft spiraled downward. At this point, the remaining bombers began breaking formation entirely, pilots forced to make split-second decisions to avoid further losses. The tactic that once seemed conventional, a low, direct run, now became a liability, each approach bringing them into the lethal sweep of improvised fire. At 8:11, the final bomber fell, trailing smoke and fire as it descended toward open fields beyond the airfield perimeter. 7 bombers destroyed in just 14 minutes. The roar of engines gradually faded, leaving behind the echoing percussion of spent rounds and the acrid tang of cordite and burning metal. Ground crews emerged cautiously from cover, their eyes wide at what had occurred. The mechanic, exhausted, covered in sweat and soot, let the crank rest for the first time. The raid, initially a threat of devastating scale, had been decisively countered by a blend of courage, ingenuity, and rapid improvisation. Yet the consequences were only beginning to reveal themselves. Damage assessment, verification, and the broader impact on RAF tactics would soon follow. The extraordinary 14 minutes had ended, but the story of innovation under fire was far from complete. As the smoke cleared over Coltishall, officers emerged from command posts, notebooks in hand, scanning the wreckage and fields beyond the airfield. Reports were chaotic at first. Scattered debris, twisted fuselages, and distant fires made it difficult to ascertain the precise impact of the raid. Standard RAF procedures required verification. Ground crews would confirm serial numbers from downed bombers, collect witness statements, and match damage reports with intelligence intercepts. Observers from adjacent squadrons were called in, binoculars trained on the shattered remains of enemy aircraft. One by one, serial numbers were logged, photographs taken, and accounts cross-referenced. Historical AA kill confirmation demanded meticulous attention. No claim was accepted without multiple corroborating sources. Yet here, the evidence was undeniable. 7 bombers had been shot down in 14 minutes, an astonishing feat for a single improvised weapon operated by a lone mechanic. Nearby airfields learned quickly of the incident. Mechanics and officers exchanged incredulous glances, struggling to reconcile the scale of destruction with the unconventional means. Rumors spread, some whispered exaggeration, others celebrated heroism, but official reports validated the act. The raid had inflicted minimal casualties on RAF personnel, while the Luftwaffe suffered a tactical blow, forcing a reassessment of low-level bombing approaches. For the RAF hierarchy, the event was both shocking and illuminating. It underscored the potential of frontline ingenuity, highlighting gaps in formal defense planning while emphasizing the resourcefulness of those on the ground. The consequences extended beyond Coltishall. This single episode would ripple across stations, influencing both tactics and morale, proving that even improvised measures could decisively shape the battlefield. The extraordinary effectiveness of the improvised weapon did not go unnoticed. RAF command began to take note of frontline ingenuity, realizing that small, adaptive measures could complement formal anti-aircraft defenses. Manuals and training sessions increasingly incorporated lessons from these incidents, encouraging mechanics to apply creative problem-solving when conventional resources were limited. The Home Guard and other auxiliary units also experimented with makeshift defensive devices, inspired by Coltishall's example, blending engineering skill with tactical necessity. For the mechanic himself, the aftermath was quieter but no less significant. He returned to routine duties, now a figure of informal legend among peers. Promotions were considered but constrained by the rigid structure of RAF personnel hierarchy. Still, his actions earned private commendations and the enduring respect of both fellow mechanics and squadron officers. His invention remained on the airfield for months, not as an official weapon, but as a testament to ingenuity under pressure, often studied by other mechanics for lessons in rapid adaptation. The raid's broader impact extended beyond individual recognition. It forced a reassessment of Luftwaffe tactics over lightly defended airfields, demonstrating that a determined, well-trained crew could offset numerical and technological disadvantages. Engineers and commanders alike began to view improvisation not as a gamble, but as a calculated, essential complement to conventional strategies. The event also left a psychological imprint. Pilots and ground crews gained confidence, while enemy airmen faced the unnerving reality of unpredictable defenses. In this sense, the 14-minute defense at Coltishall became more than a singular episode. It became a case study in human ingenuity, mechanical skill, and the tactical advantage of initiative. It set the stage for reflection on what true innovation under fire could accomplish, bridging the immediate chaos of battle with the lasting lessons that would influence both strategy and human understanding. The 14 minutes at Coltishall were more than a tactical success. They were a testament to the human capacity for invention under pressure. In the midst of an industrialized, mechanized war, where planes, engines, and guns dominated the landscape, it was the resourcefulness of a single mechanic that reshaped the outcome of a raid. Desperation became a catalyst for creativity, proving that ingenuity often emerges not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the frozen, smoke-filled spaces between chaos and necessity. This act reflects the duality of humanity in war, disciplined yet improvisational, fearful yet resolute. Machines may dominate the sky, but it is the hands that craft, the mind that calculates, and the heart that endures that leave a lasting mark. In a conflict defined by mass formations and precise logistics, moments like these remind us that individual skill and courage still hold the power to change events in ways no strategy could predict. The improvised Gatling-like weapon, constructed from scrap and sustained by determination, symbolizes the intersection of technology and humanity. It speaks to the adaptability of those who refuse to surrender to circumstance, who transform limitations into tools of survival and defense. As smoke cleared over the airfield and silence replaced the roar of engines, the true victory was not just in the bombers downed, but in the affirmation of human initiative. In the stillness that followed, history absorbed a quiet truth: even amid the machinery of war, it is human ingenuity, courage, and resolve that shapes destiny.